Here's an interesting fact for you. The question of where Jewish people came from is one of the most debated topics in both religious and academic circles. And I'm not talking about recent debates. I'm talking about controversies that have raged for thousands of years. Where did the Jewish people actually originate? Was Abraham a real historical figure or a myth? Did the Exodus from Egypt actually happen? Are modern Jews directly descended from ancient Israelites, or is the connection more complicated than we've been told? These aren't just academic questions. These are questions that have sparked wars, inspired movements, and divided scholars for generations. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The answers depend entirely on who you ask. In this video, we're diving deep into why the origins of the Jewish people remain so intensely controversial. We'll explore the competing narratives, the archaeological evidence that both supports and contradicts traditional accounts, and the modern genetic discoveries that have completely reshaped this conversation. But more importantly, we're going to understand why this controversy matters so much. Because the story of Jewish origins isn't just about the past. It's about identity, legitimacy, and claims that affect millions of people today. So buckle up. This journey is going to challenge everything you thought you knew. Let's start with what most people learn first, the traditional biblical narrative. According to the Hebrew Bible, Jewish origins begin with Abraham, a man called by God to leave his homeland of Ur and journey to Canaan around 2000 BC. His grandson Jacob, later renamed Israel, had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes. These tribes eventually ended up enslaved in Egypt, were freed by Moses in a miraculous exodus, wandered the desert for 40 years, and then conquered Canaan under Joshua. It's a powerful, cohesive narrative. One people, one origin, one divine mission. But here's where things get controversial. Modern archaeology and historical scholarship have struggled to find evidence supporting large portions of this narrative. And I mean really struggled. There's no Egyptian record of Hebrew slaves, no archaeological evidence of a massive exodus, no signs of a military conquest of Canaan by outside invaders. The walls of Jericho, they didn't fall when the biblical timeline suggests they should have. Does this mean the biblical account is fiction? Not necessarily. But it means the relationship between the traditional narrative and historical reality is far more complex than a straightforward reading suggests. And this is where the controversy begins to heat up. Some scholars argue that the Israelites were actually indigenous Canaanites, who gradually developed a distinct identity. Others suggest a small group of escaped slaves from Egypt joined with Canaanite populations, and their story became amplified over time. Still others defend the essential accuracy of the biblical account, while acknowledging that details may have been simplified or dramatized. Each of these positions has passionate defenders and critics. Each has implications that extend far beyond academic debate. Because if the Exodus didn't happen as described, what does that mean for Jewish identity? If Abraham wasn't a real person, what happens to the covenant? If the conquest of Canaan is more complex than the Bible suggests, how does that affect modern territorial claims? These aren't just theoretical questions. Let me walk you through the archaeological evidence, because this is where things get really fascinating and really complicated. The problem isn't that there's no ancient evidence. The problem is that the evidence we have doesn't always align with when and how the traditional narrative says things happened. Take the city of Jericho, for example. According to the biblical account, Joshua led the Israelites to conquer this fortified city around 1400 BC, with its walls famously falling after the Israelites marched around them. Archaeological excavations show that Jericho did have walls and they did fall. But here's the issue. The destruction happened centuries before the traditional biblical timeline. And when Joshua supposedly arrived, Jericho wasn't even inhabited. Or consider Egypt. With all the detailed record-keeping the ancient Egyptians were famous for, you'd expect some mention of Hebrew slaves, devastating plagues, or the loss of a significant portion of their workforce. Yet Egyptian records from the proposed time period are silent on all of this. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as scholars like to say. This brings us to one of the most controversial theories in biblical scholarship, that the Jewish people don't have a single point of origin at all. This idea challenges everything about the traditional narrative. According to this theory, what we call the Jewish people emerged from multiple different groups that gradually coalesced over centuries. Some may have been escaped slaves from Egypt. Others were Canaanite farmers who rejected the hierarchical city-state system. Still others were nomadic pastoralists from the edges of settled civilization. These diverse groups, according to this theory, eventually unified around shared stories, laws, and religious practices. The biblical narrative of unified origins came later, created to give this diverse coalition a common identity and purpose. It's called the peasant revolt model in some circles, popularized by scholars like Norman Gottwald. The idea is that early Israelites were essentially Canaanite underclasses, who broke away from oppressive city-states and formed egalitarian communities in the highlands. Other scholars prefer the infiltration model, suggesting gradual